announcements. Next Friday's forum will feature John Hoffmeister, who is the president of Shell Oil. He will be talking about the subject of ensuring U.S. energy supply for the future. City Club is celebrating the American Library Association's Banned Book Week with two events. First, the City Club Citizens Read will be reading one of the most notoriously banned books in American history, Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee's fictionalized account of the John Scopes monkey trial called Inherit the Wind. The City Club is also planning a special screening of the movie adaptation of Inherit the Wind. The movie will be next Thursday night, and the book discussion will be the following Monday on October 30th. If you have an interest in coming, please do. This is open to non-members and members alike. Please call City Club and let them know you'll be there. The books are for sale on the back counter. And finally, we have another party, a final Friday forum. Next week, 4:30 to 6 in the afternoon at City Club. This is a great time to come to meet other City Club members, to talk to interesting people about interesting subjects, and to learn more about the club. Again, this is open to members and guests, no RSVP required. Details on this event and others can be found in your forum bulletin or online at pdxcityclub.org. And you can also find information about membership, our TV and radio broadcast schedule, and you can listen to the forum online or purchase CDs or audio tapes. Before we begin today, I'd like to introduce Eva Schweber. Eva was chair of the FPDNR Research Committee and the Advocacy Committee. She's going to briefly speak about the ballot measure. Eva.
Thank you. As some of you may know, my committee studied the Fire Police Disability and Retirement Fund for the 12th time this past year. And I guess 12th time is the charm because we finally have reforms on the ballot measure number 2686. The reforms actually solve the problem of having beneficiaries make disability decisions. It requires an independent audit of the program itself. And the current system, if I can just remind you of the pension side system, is that the pension fund has primacy over city services. And as we are looking at many other funding measures this year, this will, over time, eliminate the unfunded liability, which is currently $1.64 billion, and left unchanged will become over $8 billion in 40 years. Tax bills came out this week. I looked at mine. If you want to take a look at yours, you will see the line for FPDNR is larger than anything else there. So since we had a unanimous approval of our study, let me please, on behalf of my committee and behalf of all fellow City Club members, please vote yes on ballot measure 2686. And I just want to add to something Susan said. We will have representatives from the FPDNR study committee at the ballot measure party. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to come and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. We are fortunate in Portland to have great corporate citizens, and two of them are our sponsors this quarter. Our sponsors are Baron Liebman, LLP, and Zimmer Kunzel Frasca Partnership. Would you please join me in thanking them? Before we begin our debate, I'd like to say a word about how we operate here at City Club. As you know, we have dealt with some very controversial issues this fall, some that tend to hit a raw nerve. This is exactly what we ought to be doing at City Club, and we try to do it well. In preparing for today's debate, our program committee follows a rigorous process to ensure fairness for the sides being represented, as well as an interesting, lively, and an informative debate for our members and for the public. A subgroup researches the topic and creates questions that are reviewed for fairness by other members of the program committee and by City Club staff. The order of speaking is determined by a coin flip. A moderator is sought who will be perceived by each side as neutral. Each side of the ballot measure is allowed to choose any spokesperson to represent them. In two of the forums this fall, one of the sides has chosen a spokesperson who happens to be a member of the City Club Program Committee. We think that's a sign that we attract high-caliber people. However, when that happens, as is the case today, the chosen person is recused from any role in preparing the forum, has no advanced access to questions, and no special ability to alter the debate's format. We strive to be, to borrow a phrase, fair and balanced. Our program today is a new spending cap for Oregon. This is a discussion of Ballot Measure 48, featuring panelists Don Mcintire and Steve Novick, and our moderator will be Paul Warner, Legislative Revenue Officer for the state of Oregon. Mr. Mcintire, at the end of the table, is the president of Taxpayer Association of Oregon and president of the Executive Club, a conservative action group. Don first came to Oregon in 1971 and started in the health club business. In the late 70s, he became involved in Oregon politics, and since then, he's been involved in many political battles, primarily fighting against government taxing and spending. When his landmark Oregon property tax limit was approved by the voters in 1990, Don became known as the father of Measure 5. Don is co-author and chief petitioner of Measure 48. Steve Novick, on my immediate right, is currently a communications consultant with Pyramid Communications. He has spent much of the last 10 years studying the Oregon state budget. He served as director of the Center for Constructive Citizen Action, which helped lead the charge against Measure 8 in year 2000, the spending limit ballot, of which Mr. Mcintire was a proponent. Steve is a graduate of the University of Oregon and Harvard Law School. Among Steve's many accomplishments, or at least this is how it was reported in the New York Times, is that on the day Newt Gingrich was sworn in as Speaker of the House, Steve arranged for a group of witches to convene on the terrace of the United States Capitol building and cast an eye of Newt into a bubbling cauldron. As a result of the witch's curse, or so the story is told, Gingrich's speakership lasted only 4 years. Our moderator on my left is Paul Warner. Paul Warner is the Legislative Revenue Officer for the state of Oregon, and he's served in that capacity since 1999. The Legislative Revenue Office is a permanent, nonpartisan legislative service agency. It provides research and analysis on tax policy and school finance issues for legislators, legislative committees, and for the public. For 10 years prior to coming to the legislative branch, Paul was Oregon's state economist. In that capacity, he analyzed the state revenue, and he was the chief economic and demographic forecasting arm of the general fund and lottery revenue. Paul holds a PhD in economics from Washington State University. And at this time, I'll turn the program over to Paul.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to say that there's no truth to the rumor that I was asked to do this because no PAC-10 officials were available. However, I will say it is true we will not be using instant replay. So, my role in this is really to ensure that our two participants have the time, and the most important part of that is the work that Chris Cochran will do for us. He's our timekeeper today, so he will make sure that the participants stay on the time guidelines. And let me spend a few minutes to go through those with you. First of all, each panelist will be given a 4-minute opening to state their position on Measure 48. Secondly, the panelists will respond to questions from me, but those questions are suggested by City Club members. And so Susan had gone through the process in which those questions are selected. The questions will be directed toward one of the individual participants who will have 90 seconds to respond, and then the other participant will have 60 seconds as a follow-up response to that question. The third segment will be that each panelist can ask the other a question. So there'll be one question each on which the panelists will direct to one another. Finally, there will be a section of questions from the audience to the participants, you being the audience. Finally, there will be a 3-minute time period for each candidate or each participant to have closing statements. So I'd like to start off before we turn to the opening statements from the participants, just a very brief description from me on Measure 48. And this really comes primarily from our research report from the Legislative Revenue Office that was issued on August 31st. Measure 48 will appear on the November 2006 general election ballot. It is a state constitutional amendment designed to limit the rate of growth in state government spending. The measure limits total spending growth to the sum of the rate of increase in the state's population and the general inflation rate in the prior 2-year period. Total spending is defined as, quote, all disbursements, end quote, with a list of exceptions, the largest being expenditures from federal funds. The measure establishes an exception process in which the limit can be exceeded on a one-time basis with 2/3 approval from both chambers of the legislature and a majority vote in a statewide general election. So I'd like to start off with the questions for our participants. And the first question, opening statements and then my questions. So the first opening statement will be from Mr. Mcintire.
Thank you very much, Paul. Glad to be in front of the City Club. I occasionally make forays down here and appropriately introduce Susan. It should have been Don Quixote Mcintire, based on my ability to convince the City Club about the efficaciousness of limiting the growth of government. But nevertheless, hope springs eternal. I am going to describe the measure within my few minutes here simply this way. It is not Colorado's measure. And the reason I'm saying that is because the airwaves, the newspapers, every discussion of this measure by the opposition insists on two things. It says that the Oregon Measure 48 is essentially the same as Colorado's Tabor Amendment, Taxpayer Bill of Rights measure, and that, this is the second part of the argument, is that Tabor was a big failure. Both of those are incorrect, and I believe that will come out in the discussion this afternoon. But here is what the measure is to amplify on Mr. Warner's statements. It simply says that when the legislature gets together each session from now on, when it passes, is that they can go ahead and budget with all the powers they have now, and they can increase spending from one budget to the next. They look at the last budget, they see how much they spent, and they can increase it. And it will increase, but when they reach a level that is the growth, as he mentioned, of population and inflation leading up to that budget period, then they've got to stop. That, then, if they want to go beyond that, they need permission from the voters to exceed that amount. Now, what that means in practical terms is that when you hear about cuts to government programs because of Measure 48, cut is a code word for 8.5% increase in the next budget. Historically, that cut will amount to 10% growth a biennium because legislative revenue and fiscal have determined that population and inflation in Oregon grow historically at 10% a biennium. Now you want to compare that to another figure, and that's how much has the legislature historically increased spending in that same interregnum. It's 14%. The way the measure works then is that without approval of the people, the legislature can increase spending. They bump into the limit. If they want to go beyond it, they ask the people. The other way that they can get at that money that they couldn't spend, which, by the way, we refer to as rainy day funds, the way they can get at it two ways. Vote of the people, as I mentioned, and then there could be that awkward situation where we may have a giant economic downturn and the amount of money collected by the government isn't sufficient to hit the limit. In that case, then the funds set aside will be automatically available, thereby slowing the rough times and, in fact, guaranteeing virtually that the government grows on a steady, regular basis for a more efficient set of governance and something that is not that does not fluctuate. I think by the time this meeting is over, you will realize that Ballot Measure 48, the Rainy Day Amendment, is the essence of prudence. Thank you.
Politics is full of people who claim that they found some nice, simple formula that will make everything better for everybody forever, and nobody will have to pay any kind of price. Politics is full of such people, and none of them are telling the truth, because real life is more complicated than that. Mr. Mcintire is one such person. He and his sponsor, Mr. Howard Rich of New York, yes, the man paying for this measure is a New York billionaire literally named Mr. Rich. Mr. Mcintire and Mr. Rich claim they found this nice, simple formula to use to run the state budget forever. And when I say forever, I mean forever, because they're planning to put it in the Constitution, and that's supposed to be about forever. Their formula is the state budget can't grow by more than inflation plus population. It's a great soundbite. Might sound great if you don't study it for more than 30 seconds. But if you study it for more than 30 seconds, you'll notice, for instance, that the inflation measure they use is the consumer price index for things like food and clothes and cars. State government doesn't buy much food or clothes or cars. It does buy health care for 300,000 children and seniors. We all know that health care costs are going up a lot faster than generic inflation. So if health care spending can only go up by generic inflation, we need to cut health care for a lot of children and seniors. Then there's public safety. The population measure they're using is the general population. Over the next 9 years, the prison population is expected to go up nearly twice as fast as the general population. So if spending can only go up at the general population rate, that means we'll have to let a lot of bad guys out of prison. Now, maybe Mr. Mcintire will promise to go personally to every meth addict in the state and ask them to please hold down the rate of increase in crime to the rate of general population growth. But I'm not sure that they'll all agree. And even if they do agree, you know, they might forget. They are meth addicts. It's because of flaws like these that the people of Colorado, after living with this measure for 13 years, decided last year they couldn't stand what it was doing to health care, education, public safety, and voted to suspend the measure. Now, Mr. Mcintire will tell you that this measure is different from Colorado's because this measure provides for a rainy day fund. That's both a lie and a red herring. It's a lie because nothing in this measure requires the legislature to create a rainy day fund. There's nothing in this measure to prevent the legislature, if money comes in above the cap, from turning around and giving it away to the lobbyists who take them on trips to Maui. It's a red herring because a rainy day fund does not allow you to go beyond this formula of population plus inflation. All a rainy day fund allows you to do is keep up with this formula during a recession. But it's the formula itself that strangles public services, regardless of whether there ever is a recession. The formula itself kills healthcare, education, public safety. So having this formula plus a rainy day fund is like parents telling a child, we're going to feed you nothing but bread and water from now on. But don't worry, we have a rainy day fund, so you'll always get some bread and some water. It's because of these flaws in this measure that every major business organization, every major labor organization in Oregon, the AARP, the League of Women Voters, the PTA, have all come out against this measure. Who supports this measure? Well, basically, there's Mr. Mcintire, and of course, Mr. Rich.
Okay, we're now ready to move on to the second segment of our of the debate, and that is questions that will be from me, but as I said earlier, were submitted by the City Club members who have studied this issue. And the first question is for Mr. Mcintire. To explain how you arrived at your definition of spending for purposes of the Measure 48 limit, and the follow-up to that is why not limit why not limit spending definition to discretionary spending, in other words, general fund lottery?
Pardon me, it's a little bit loud. The way to control the growth of government is to capture anything that the legislative body decides to spend money on, with the exceptions, the prudent exceptions that we made. We know that if a limit is only based on discretionary spending, those of us who do not trust the government completely know that there will be items taken off budget and spent in a different way. But I might remind you, too, that we do have a spending limit in Oregon law right now. The spending limit was adopted by the voters in 1980. The problem was it was in statute. And the legislature, from the day it was adopted, has ignored it. Now, the measure itself, the spending limit, adopted in 1980, a couple, 4 years ago, was amended by the legislature. They still have not got any utility out of it. It has not limited discretionary spending in any way. Any spending limit that we have must be in the Constitution, or the politicians will sneak around it.
Well, first of all, as to that last point, the limit the legislature adopted in 2001 limits general government spending to 8% of total personal income, and the legislature has abided by it. And as to the limit that existed previously, I asked Ken Rocco, the legislative revenue officer, whether it's been exceeded consistently, and he said he found 2 instances where it had and no other instances where it had. So the legislature has followed its own spending limits. As to non-discretionary money being limited by this measure, that's absolutely true. This measure limits spending from all sources, and it goes after state programs that pay for themselves. For instance, one of the programs limited by this measure would be the Veterans Home Loan Program. The state loans money to veterans, they pay it back, but the loans are treated under this measure as spending. Same thing for, parks fees and other programs that basically pay for themselves.
All right, thank you. We're ready for our second question, and just to remind our participants again that it's 90 seconds on the initial question and then 60 seconds on the follow-up. This next question is for Mr. Novick, and it's the general question is, doesn't Measure 48, which allows for population inflation growth, isn't that a reasonable growth for state spending?
No, it's not a reasonable growth, because the population and inflation factors that are used have no relationship to the things the state actually spends money on, such as health care and senior services. It's also not reasonable because it does not allow you to invest more in public services as the economy grows. Normally, the economy grows significantly faster than inflation plus population. For instance, in the 1990s, the economy grew by 87%, population inflation grew by 52%. In the 1960s, the economy grew by 105%, population and inflation grew by 49%. Mr. Warner can verify this, these are his numbers. So you're saying that as society gets richer, the public sector can never get richer. If we have an economic boom, we can't invest any of that economic boom in reducing class size, or paying beginning teachers more, or any of a number of other investments in education or other services that most people would think would make sense if we could afford them. One example of how this is an irrational limit is the State Legislative Fiscal Office has gone back and calculated what would the effect of this measure have been if it had been passed in 1990. That's a reasonable thing to look at. This measure is supposed to be there forever. What's its effect over time? What they concluded is that if we'd had to live with this measure since 1990, the state budget would now have to be 25% smaller than it is. 25% less money for education, public safety, health care, transportation. Does that sound reasonable?
Mr. Mcintire, 60 seconds.
Well, first of all, that last statement is patent nonsense. What his calculation presupposes that there never would have been a vote to exceed the limit. And I believe that if the citizens saw that their government was being crippled and all these services were being hurt, they would easily approve an increase, which then changes the baseline. All it takes is one vote, and we have a new base that we're working from with a new higher rate of spending out into the future, still being controlled by population. He ignores the fact that we have a vote of the people involved in this. And by the way, the use of population and inflation as a limiting factor is a legitimate economic method. It's used in a number of states, including the state of Washington, and it was definitely used in Colorado.
All right, thank you. Our next question is directed at Don Mcintire. It is that opponents of Measure 48 have raised concerns about the impact of the measure on the state's bond rating. What is your reaction to this criticism?
I think that's false, too. Remember that I don't know if you in the audience have read the text of the measure, but it exempts from the limit voter-approved general obligation bonds. Voter-approved bonds would have a very good bond rating. If you reduce total bonded debt, the bonds that you do use will get a better rating. So I think that's a false assumption that this measure would lead to higher bond rates.
Well, the state treasurer and all the experts have said that it will lead to higher bond rates. I mean, do we really want to have an election every time the state borrows money for everything? I don't think that the voters would put up with that many elections. I mean, the bonds were issued for the transportation program that Governor Kulongoski pushed through in the last couple of years. I didn't see the public rising up in outrage that money was being borrowed without their permission, and it was used to repair bridges and do tons of other neat stuff. And it's worthy of note that this measure would say that both when you borrow the money and spend it, and then when you pay it back, the money from bonds and to pay back bonds would be counted against this limit.
I'd like to thank the participants for sticking to the time guidelines. This next question is for Steve Novick. Many argue the state needs a rainy day fund. Proponents argue that 48 will accomplish this goal without formally introducing a rainy day fund because of the two subject limitation on constitutional amendments. What is your response to this?
Regardless of why it's not in there, it's not in there. This measure does not require a rainy day fund. And since the legislature has never established a rainy day fund before, there's no reason to think that it would establish one because of this measure. And it would be a lot easier to establish a reasonable rainy day fund if state revenues were allowed to grow with the economy, as under the current system and under any reasonable system. And in good times, you were able to take some of those funds and put them aside in a rainy day fund. So, I mean, but again, this measure does not establish a rainy day fund. And again, even if it did, it would be a red herring, because this would still prevent the state from raising spending on education along with the economy. It would prevent the state from keeping up with health care costs. It would prevent the state from keeping up with the rising number of seniors. The senior population over the next 20 years is expected to go up 3 times the rate of the general population, and the state does a lot for seniors, such as providing nursing home care for more than half the seniors who have nursing home care. So again, this does not create a rainy day fund, and even if it did, it would create a situation where every day in Oregon would be a rainy day, indeed a sleety day.
Steve, let me explain something to you. If you collect money and it is in reserve in the bank, it doesn't matter what you call it. If the economy declines, if revenue declines to the state, and then you can get at that money for use in expenses, that is a rainy day fund. Don't call it a rainy day fund if you don't want it. Call it oatmeal. Call it your hat. But if it's available for spending in tough times, It's a rainy day fund, and this measure guarantees that there will be money in the bank. Now, you mentioned that maybe the legislature should have created a rainy day fund. Maybe they should have, but have they? Heck no. That's the reason for this measure, to make sure that our profligate spenders, keep in mind, in the 90s, they doubled spending because of a heated economy and then set nothing aside. They spent every dime.
I think we have time for 2 more questions in this segment. This one is initially directed at Mr. Mcintire. Do you see the Colorado experience with Tabor as a good guide as to how 48 will impact Oregon? Why or why not?
Well, first of all, I hope I have enough time to tell you why the Rainy Day Amendment is different than Tabor in Colorado. I'll just say this really quickly. Tabor uses the population index, but the way it works is it's a revenue limitation. It says that you can collect revenue from the citizens until it gets to a certain point. Anything you collect over that then automatically goes back. The Oregon measure doesn't work that way at all. It doesn't limit how much comes in, it limits how much they can spend. That's how you arrive at accumulating funds over the limit for use with either a vote of the people or in economic tough times. Now, in Colorado, they turned back so much money, in the 90s especially, that it was almost $4 billion. The legislature got reckless then in 2000 and reduced tax rates so much that when the recession hit, then they put themselves in rather a bind. One of the things that they have said, and by the way, Tabor still exists, they have taken this time out to get caught up, but the one thing they said was that this would still be a great working measure, and it still is, but it should have had a rainy day fund.
Tabor was strangling public services in Colorado before the recession. Investment in public education was falling from 35th in the country to 49th as a percentage of the economy. They were dismantling their higher education system. Their roads were deteriorating. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has a detailed explanation of how Colorado's public services are crumbling before the recession. As the Oregonian pointed out, the basic measure for both of these measures is the same, both of these initiatives. It's population plus inflation, and given the definitions they use, it strangles public services. So Colorado was suffering before the recession. Colorado is, and Mr. Mcintire, by the way, I'm sure at some point will say that Colorado is actually doing great in some ways. I agree the entire state didn't fall into the sea, but most people, you don't get lung cancer as soon as you start smoking. Most people quit as soon as they get their first heart attack. That's what Colorado did, but the smartest people never start smoking at all.
Thank you. Time for one more question in this segment, and this is directed initially at Steve Novick. If Measure 48 is passed, how long do you think before voters and citizens see changes in state-funded programs and services?
It won't take very long at all, because it will mean that the state has $2.2 billion less to invest in healthcare, education, et cetera, in just this next biennium. As the Oregonian has pointed out, within 10 years, we'd be spending less on public services than all but 3 other states. Wouldn't take long at all for this to have a dramatic impact. I'd like to go back for a second to Mr. Mcintire's point that his measure allows for continued growth in state government. Keeping up with inflation, whatever the percentage, is never growth in real terms. Suppose you're renting a house and your landlord raises your rent by 20% and you pay it. Your house does not get 20% bigger. Try it sometime. This measure, again, if it had been in effect since 1990, would force the current state budget for everything to be 25% smaller, which importantly would mean either you cut 600 teachers or about 35 or 40 days out of the school year. Same in terms of days out of the school year for every other district in the state. It doesn't take this long for this measure to have a dramatic impact. And Mr. Mcintire says, oh, well, if it's having a bad impact, we can just ask the voters to change it. Well, first of all, that requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature, so a vote of 1/3 plus 1 of the legislature, an anti-democratic vote, could stop any of this from happening. And secondly, why would you want to put something in the Constitution that you know that you're going to have to ask the voters to change on a regular basis?
You don't know that you're going to have to ask the voters to change it. One of the things I'll tell you, first of all, the Oregonian figures are nonsense because it does presuppose nothing other than a fixed implementation of the measure out ad infinitum. That it will not work that way. They can't say what they're saying any more than the governor, who said recently, if Measure 48 passes, it will cut $2.2 billion out of the budget. That begs the question, Governor, what budget? It hasn't been written yet. You haven't been elected yet. You cannot forecast the future in that manner. But one thing I will tell you, Steve, if this measure had been implemented in 1990, we sure wouldn't have the PERS crisis that we have right now, where we have billions and billions of dollars owing to that system. It wouldn't have happened if we'd have had a spending limit in place.
Okay, we're ready to move to the next section of the program. During this portion, each panelist will have the opportunity to ask a question of the other. Questions must be asked in 30 seconds. The other panelists will have 1 minute to respond, after which the questioner will have the option of a 30-second rebuttal. So, Mr. Novick, your question of Mr. Mcintire.
Don, in 1990, you sponsored a measure which ordered the state government to take over the lion's share of public school funding. Now that the legislature has done that, you complain that state government has grown too much, even though the biggest factor in that growth is doing what you ordered them to do. Isn't your real goal to effectively destroy the public education system, as reflected in the Oregonian article 2 years ago, which said of you, he favors a public school system that requires parents with the means to pay for their children's schooling, with public subsidies going only to parents who can't afford the cost?
Not a bad idea. Steve, the passage of Ballot Measure 5 only had some political language in it that said that when this measure is affected, the Legislative Assembly shall make sure that the schools have the money that they're going to lose from the implementation of the measure. And the reason I say that was a political statement, one would think that a lawyer would know that the Constitution had already told the legislature that it is responsible for a general system of common schools. That's Article 8, Section 3 of the Oregon Constitution. The reason Measure 5 was necessary because property taxes were going out of sight because of school taxes, because the legislature was derelict in its responsibility of funding the public school system.
You have 30-second rebuttal. That's your option.
With property taxes being cut, there was no option to maintain the schools other than the legislature coming up with the money to backfill. And the percentage of school funding paid for by the legislature went from about 28% to now about 60%, reversing what things had been before. And the schools, I mean, there were predictions that the schools would be totally destroyed when Measure 5 passed. Those predictions were not as true as people might have thought, only because the legislature did what you're now complaining about they're doing.
All right. Mr. Mcintire, your first question for Mr. Novick, and you've got 30 seconds for this question with a 60-second response.
Steve, Governor Kulongoski has called for the creation of a rainy day fund equaling 10% of the general fund. That may surprise you, but I agree with him on this. We just seem to disagree on how to fund it. You have the ear of the public employee unions, so how would they fund a rainy day fund at that level? Would you take the corporate kicker? Would you raise taxes? Or would you have no rainy day fund at all?
I'm not here to speak for anybody else and how they would create a rainy day fund. However, I think pretty much anybody other than yourself who would like to have a rainy day fund would say that it should come from good times when revenues the state gets exceed what's necessary to keep up with the real population and inflation drivers in the state budget, which this measure would prohibit them from doing. By the way, the point about PERS, If Mr. Mcintire had a problem with PERS or any other specific part of the state budget, he could have done an initiative that went after those specific parts of the budget he objects to. He did not. This measure does not set any priorities for the state budget. It does not go after anything that's particularly wasteful. It leaves all the decisions to be made to the state legislators and their friends in Maui.
Do I, 30 seconds?
30 seconds.
Well, the only point I want to make is that he's making my point. You cannot get our body politic to establish a rainy day fund or whatever you want to call it. The 90s is the best example. Money came pouring in because of an economy stimulated by the introduction of computers at all levels of economic life, and it put a lot of people to work, and dough came running in to the governments all over the country. Prudent states saved some of it, especially Colorado.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. We've come to that point in our program where we will have questions from the audience. The first question, however, will be asked by our board host today, Doug Marker. Doug is immediate past president of City Club. He serves as director of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's Fish and Wildlife Program, and he has been a City Club member since 1991. Doug.
Thank you, Susan. My question is somewhat philosophical. Oregon has a tradition of cutting taxes but mandating spending. We passed tax limits with Measures 5 and 50, but we also mandated increased spending on prisons with Measure 11. In the last legislature, the legislature discussed setting a mandated level for education spending. My question is, if there is an overall spending limit, should voters or the legislature mandate how much of the resulting budget is spent on specific programs?
Who's it to?
Either one of you, or both.
First of all, I just want to say in regard to Measure 48 that the measure does not abolish the legislature. Those very kind of decisions are the kinds that the legislature should make. It's still their call. That's for political give and take, debate, input from citizens, but that's the legislative process. That's the thing about Measure 48. It is not complicated. It does not hamstring the legislature. It just simply says you have one more constitutional limitation like the balanced budget part of the Constitution. When you increase spending this much, then ask us. We give you more, go ahead, debate it on how you're going to spend it, but those are your decisions to make after either whether or not we have Measure 48 or not.
No matter who's making the decisions, the legislature or the voters, the decisions that we made under Measure 48 are not pretty, because the services the state government provides are fairly basic things like transportation and health care and education and public safety and senior services. And it is not going to be possible to live under Measure 48 and to avoid savage cuts to those services. What you'll see happening are things like happened in Colorado, where after a while the voters passed a measure that said that education spending could grow at a 1% higher rate than inflation. Well, that means that there had to be even more vicious cuts in things like transportation and health care. You'd see the people who support one public service or another cannibalizing each other in order to try to scramble out of this death grip.
Okay, time for questions from the audience. Questions are reserved for City Club members only. They take 30 seconds or less. They end with a question mark, and they are not a speech. When you ask your question, if you'd like, please direct it at one of the panelists.
Eva Schweber, City Club member. This is a question for Don Mcintire. One of the things we have learned through the Fire Police Disability and Retirement Fund reform in the City of Portland is that contractual obligations supersede the provision of services by government. Does Measure 48 address the issue of contractual obligations? Because otherwise there's the possibility that the legislative money would be mandated to go to contracts such as PERS rather than providing services.
Well, first of all, my sympathy for having to deal with the Portland Retirement and Disability Fund, which is one of the greatest abominations this city ever created. That's a subject for another day. But again, when you're talking about contractual obligations, there will be decisions for the legislature to make whether or not they're going to attempt to break contracts. They can't do that by law. But one thing they can do, certainly, is reform the way money is spent by the state government. Again, probably a topic for another day, but our government wastes so much money at an incredible rate that the devastation that Steve talks about is hyperbole. Much of the savings, virtually all of it, could be taken with smart spending and better economies.
On the issue of contractual obligations, one point it's important to note is that although this measure on its face exempts federal funds, that's a mirage, because most of the federal money the state gets, it requires a state match. For instance, Medicaid funds, we basically get $3 federal for every $2 we spend on health care. So if we have to cut spending on health care, we no longer get our fair share of federal money. And in fact, if we cut spending on health care enough, we won't be able to provide Medicaid to the populations that the federal government requires you to provide in order to have Medicaid at all. So ultimately, we would end up losing all of our federal health care money, which is a heck of a lot of money, and it would mean that it would mean that pretty much nobody who gets health care from the state now, and again, there's 300,000 children and seniors would get health care.
Chris Allman, City Club member. I'm going to be directing my question to Mr. Mcintire, piggybacking a bit on Mr. Novick's comments regarding Measure 5. My son has no school today. He has parent-teacher conferences, so I brought him here to have him see the architect of Measure 5. And resultingly, for Measure 5, we now have third, fourth, largest class sizes in the country. So my question for you, Mr. Mcintire, is why do you want to continue to further decimate public school education for my son and the other children of Oregon?
Well, I don't agree with you at all. Keep in mind, let me remind you something, that the reason for Measure 5 was because property taxes were unbearable for many of our citizens. There were places in this state where you could be living in a $60,000 ranchie, having to pay $3,000 a year for the privilege of living in your own home, no matter what your circumstances were. You could be retired, you could be handicapped, didn't matter. The state wants its pound of flesh. 2/3 of that property tax was for the schools. Measure 5 said we've got to control property taxes. Let's have the legislature do what it's supposed to do. That's why the burden shifted back to them. But keep in mind that the cost of the schools that you're talking about, a tremendous amount of that goes into pay benefits at a rate that is unbelievable to the private citizen. 22% of all payroll dollars go into PERS.
My name is Gavin White. I'm a City Club member, and for full disclosure, I'm also the chair of the Democratic Party in Multnomah County. Mr. Mcintire, Mr. Novick, thank you for being with us today. Mr. Mcintire, you have repeatedly dodged any association between Ballot Measure 48 and the failed Tabor Amendment in Colorado, and yet you seem to be claiming that their decimated public services are an improvement. So please, can you tell us, is it in fact an improvement to destroy public services, and is this in fact Colorado's Tabor?
I don't know how many times I have to tell you this. The two measures are not the same. That Colorado's measure does have a glitch in it that this measure does not have. But to advance the idea that Colorado's measure is a failure flies in the face of the facts. I refer you to the Oregon Progress Board business plan, 2006 competitive index. Look it up on the internet. You go to that, and the index compares all 50 states to each other, and when you see that, you will see that Colorado kicks Oregon's butt in virtually every category of measurement about the welfare of its citizens, from per capita income to median family income to people below poverty. Colorado is in much better shape. So it is a dodge and a lie that Colorado is collapsing around itself.
You know, I was looking around on the internet the other day and found an article from a Colorado paper talking about how in recent years, before they suspended Tabor, poverty was rising, median family incomes were falling. Colorado was beginning to suffer the economic consequences of disinvestment in public services, as their business community recognized when they got strongly. It was the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce that was the driving force behind suspending Tabor. And they were tired of their investment in public education falling to 49th as a percentage of the economy. They were tired of the ratio of parole and probation officers to released prisoners falling. And yes, I agree, the whole state didn't fall into the sea. But again, this is a slow-acting poison like smoking cigarettes. And just as you do not get lung cancer as soon as you start smoking, you don't fall into the sea as soon as you adopt this measure. But smart people quit when they first get their first heart attack. That's what Colorado did. And smarter people never start smoking at all, and that's what Oregon's going to do.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. In his extraordinary book, Collapse, Jared Diamond says that every society, in order to survive, must have a strong and well-regulated government that assures the basic needs of its citizens will be met. If our legislature has not served its citizens well, why aren't we focused on electing a stronger legislature that will do this, rather than adding, I think, what sounds like a bureaucratic hamstring of their work, to their work and deliberations with rigid, reactionary constraints such as this suggests. And I would ask Mr. Novick to respond first to that question.
Well, I'm not here today to talk about whether the legislature is good or bad, although I have made some references to Maui. I couldn't resist. I mean, the legislature largely works within what, the cards it's dealt, what the economy deals with it, what initiatives deal it, et cetera. And the legislature divides up money among transportation, education, healthcare, public safety, et cetera. They sometimes make decisions that I don't particularly agree with, but I mean, they're working within largely constraints that they're dealt. And the constraint that this measure would deal with them would be something that no legislature, even if they were composed of genius saints, would be able to live with. They would not be able to provide adequate public services no matter who they were.
One of the adjectives that you used was well-regulated legislature, and that's what Measure 48 seeks to do. We do have a representative government. The problem is, ma'am, it turns out that our legislature, with the power of the incumbency, doesn't represent us. If you'll notice that when the citizens go out and approve something, the legislature has not followed in a representative sense. For example, Measure 5 passed by a bare majority, but it passed. One would have thought that maybe half the legislature would have supported it. No way. Same with the sales tax. Majority of the legislature thinks we ought to have a sales tax. The citizens throw that out 3 and 4 to 1. So they represent somebody, but it ain't us.
We'll now move to the portion of our program that are the closing statements of each of the panelists. Mr. Mcintire, we'll begin with you. You have 3 minutes.
Again, I know I'm tilting at windmills. This is a very liberal organization, and for whatever reason, people on the left love lots of government. I, from the school that thinks that we ought to restrain the government as best we can and have government do those things that government should be doing, and not waste so much money on doing things that the government shouldn't be doing. That's ne'er the twain shall meet. But I appreciate having been here today before you. I hope some of what I've said registered with some of you. Remember that every time the opposition talks about cuts, they're really talking about, on average, 10% increases. So when my man here says cuts to education, he's saying at least 10% increase to education, but it'll be more than that because of the tremendous lobbying power of the Oregon Education Association and the other government unions. So here I am, Don Quixote. I do believe, and think about this, there's no reason for me to do this other than the fact that I'm acting on principle, and I think it will make all Oregon a better place to live and do business if we restrain the growth of government, give our legislators the ability to budget within guardrails. And then occasionally, when they've got to go outside the guardrails, just talk to us. We're the voters. All power in this state, in Article 1, Section 1 of the Oregon Constitution, all power is inherent in the people. I believe that, and I think we should live by that.
Mr. Mcintire says that Colorado wasn't hurt by Tabor, and he talks about Colorado kicking Oregon's butt. All I can say is, Mr. Mcintire must not be an Oregon Duck fan. Because if he were a Duck fan, he would have watched the Fiesta Bowl in 2002. And he would have seen firsthand the impact this kind of measure has on a state. Granted, Oregon had a great team, but Colorado was pathetic because they were hampered by Tabor. Their linemen weren't allowed to be any bigger than the general population. Their cornerbacks weren't allowed to run any faster than the Consumer Price Index. And so, of course, Joey Harrington threw 4 touchdown passes, and Oregon crushed Colorado 38-16. If we ever want to win the Fiesta Bowl again, we must defeat Measure 48. Abraham Lincoln once asked, why should we have government? He answered his own question. The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. There are many such things: making and maintaining roads, bridges, and the like, providing for the helpless young and afflicted, common schools, the civil and criminal justice departments. These old-fashioned meat and potatoes services that Abe Lincoln wrote about are the same services your state government provides today. 90% of the general fund goes to education, healthcare, public safety, and services for seniors. And it's these basic meat and potatoes services that will be hurt if we pass this measure. Mr. Mcintire and Mr. Rich say that they've knitted us a nice new cap for the state budget. But when it comes to healthcare, this cap doesn't fit. When it comes to public safety, this cap doesn't fit. When it comes to services for seniors, this cap doesn't fit. When it comes to public education, this cap doesn't fit. To paraphrase a late, great advocate, if it doesn't fit, don't vote for it. Thank you, and please vote no on Measure 48.
I'd like to thank our panelists, Don Mcintire and Steve Novick, for being here today, our moderator, Paul Warner, for your participation, and our timekeeper, Chris Cochran. I'd also like to thank the members and guests of City Club for being here today, and our TV and radio audience for your interest in City Club. We are adjourned.
Mm-hmm.